I'm a 24-year-old female, and I lease an awfully little house close my work. Nothing has ever happened to me like this sometime recently, but a short time later, I have been much more cautious, almost who my companions are. The day begun out the same as each other weekday. I went to work, came back domestic, made a few supper, at that point sat on the sofa to observe an appear or a motion picture. It was Friday, so I liked to remain up a small afterward than normal, but in some cases my eyes wouldn't let me. I turned on a motion picture around 8 o'clock, and at a few point I fell snoozing amid it. It wasn't until a sharp and sudden sound made me bounce back out of rest. It was my phone and a sound I had never listened sometime recently. I picked it up from the coffee table and squinted my eyes at the shinning screen. It was a notice for a message I'd gotten on Facebook. Opening it, it took me straight to the Facebook delivery person app, which I had never really utilized sometime recently. I was befuddled seeing a content from a man basically saying hi. His title looked commonplace, but was unquestionably not one of my near companions. I clicked on his profile and saw that we had one shared companion, which we'd been companions on Facebook for 4 months. It started my memory from when I acknowledged his welcome. Truly, I fair acknowledge anyone's welcome as long as they have common companions with me. I do not share anything as well private online, so it never truly mattered to me. I went back to the flag bearer app and fair said howdy to be neighbourly, in spite of the fact that two starting to recognise how late it was, and how odd it was to arbitrarily content somebody at this time. Promptly after I sent it, the 3 devs showed up as the individual was writing, taken after by a modern message. Perusing it, I promptly wheezed and dropped my phone on the table, whereas looking over at the window. The content perused. I adore that motion picture as well. We ought to observe it together. I didn't see anything exterior the window, in spite of the fact that it was totally dark exterior. I was shaking, knowing presently that somebody was unquestionably observing me. I felt super awkward as well, not knowing how long they'd been observing. At that point, I listened my phone beep once more and light up with a new message. I was stunned and fair gazed at my phone on the table, incapable to move, and as well frightened to see at the message. I can't indeed tell you how long I was solidified there, for as everything fair felt so interesting some time recently the doorbell rang. I bounced once more, presently with tears in my eyes from the froze state I was in. I snatched my phone and dialed 911. At that point attempted to clarify my circumstance as best I might, whereas overpowered and crying. The administrator told me they have somebody on their wayfare 5 minutes out and told me to bolt myself in a room and hold up for the assistance to reach. I concurred, attempting to calm myself down. Fair as I was finishing the call, another message came through. At that point another and another. Spamming my phone with that terrible beep sound some time recently, I turned it on quiet. I scarcely got myself to open them, and saw possibly 10 or 15 messages in all caps of the man requesting me to open the entryway. At that point, the exceptionally final message essentially studied, never intellect. I didn't know what that implied, but it as it were took a number of seconds for me to discover out. A delicate blast came from the other side of the house. It was exceptionally suppressed as in the event that it were distant absent, in spite of the fact that. I stood still, tuning in for a minute sometime recently another, louder blast reverberated through the corridor by the kitchen. Able to listen the sound more clearly presently, I might tell it was coming from the cellar. I rapidly ran to my room, hearing another much louder blast followed by something shattering. I bolted myself within the room, crying wildly from the fear of the circumstance as I tuned in to the sounds of the man making his way through the cellar and up the stairs. I knew I kept the storm cellar entryway bolted, but I was beyond any doubt the man would break through at any miniature. I listened the doorknob rattling taken after by a few pushes, as in case endeavouring to thrust through it. Sometime recently 3 uproarious thumps came from the front entryway. "Police, open up!" I sprinted to the front entryway, opening it and letting them in. There were 2 male police officers, and I think they might see the stress in my eyes. I pointed to the cellar entryway, talking fast, and telling them that he was in there, and they instantly took their weapons out and hurried in. The intruder's strides ran down the steps as the officers opened the entryway and carefully taken after. They caught the man after a speedy battle. To keep this brief, the man had broken in through the window well within the cellar, so that's what the clamour was. As for who he was, he really was the man on Facebook. I assumed he was utilising a fake account or something, but no, that was really him. He didn't provide any reason for breaking in aside from clearly fair needing to conversation to me. It was exceptionally odd and frightening. I'd never had anything like that happen sometime recently, as I kind of fair thought these were things that as it were happened in motion pictures. Afterward that week, I went through my companions list and evacuated anybody I didn't know actually. It's sad that I have to do that, but I figure usually the world we live in presently. I was at domestic making supper on a normal night after work. It was around 7 p.m, or possibly indeed afterward, and I'd gotten domestic from work as it were an hour sometime recently. I wasn't making anything fair a little chicken breast and a few solidified corn. I had fair wrapped up with the chicken and started depleting the water from the corn when a light scratching sound came through the house. It was brief and speedy and not exceptionally uproarious, but the weirdness of the sound made me wince a small. I proceeded doing what I was doing, considering it was fair a few odd sound that the house was making that I fair never listened sometime recently. But at that point, once more that same scratching sound vibrated through the dividers. It was such an bizarre sound I had no thought what to think of it. I rapidly wrapped up plating my nourishment at that point, went toward the front entryway to tune in for it once more, trusting to pinpoint where it was coming from. I held up for perhaps 30 seconds, not hearing anything. At that point went back to the table to eat. Indeed, still at this point I wasn't considering anything of it. I was as it were inquisitive as to why the house was making that sound, but I wasn't stressed within the smallest. I went through a couple of minutes eating. At that point went over to the love seat to rest and observe a few Netflix for a bit. But through the appear I would continually listen that upsetting scratching sound over and over. In the long run it was fair getting so disturbing that I turned off the TV and fair held up, tuning in. When the sound came once more, I was able to listen it more clearly coming from some place upstairs. I rapidly strolled up to the moment floor, still fair irritated at the house for destroying my night, but too a bit more concerned that there may really be something off base with the house. At the best of the steps I remained within the passage holding up once more for the sound. An entire miniature went by of nothing, so I started looking the rooms to create beyond any doubt everything was affirmed. It didn't appear like anything was unordinary or broken, so presently I was beginning to truly get confounded and stressed. I put a few shoes on and went exterior, and whereas it was dim, I figured I'd possibly be able to see a tree scratching against the house, or conceivably a few other issues. I went to the side of the house where I knew there was a tree, but it wasn't blustery at all, and the branches were no place close the side. I kind of fair stood there pondering how this was happening, and why it all of a sudden begun this evening. I was tired, and this was the final thing I needed to be doing. I strolled back around to the front of the house, and on my way to the front entryway a glint of light came within the side of my vision. I turned and looked because it apparently came from the front of the house. I strolled down the garage by the walkway and looked back, and that's when I saw a little light coming from one of the windows in a dim room of my domestic. After a few seconds, I realized it was the storage room window, which the light was moving nearly like somebody was sparkling an electric lamp around. I was shocked. Somebody was in my loft doing who knows what and for how long. I remained out front calling the police as I gazed at the window observing the light move around gradually. But as I was talking on the phone, the light got dimmer before shining straight forwardly at me. They held it there for a few seconds. At that point closed it off. And indeed from exterior, I was able to listen a number of boisterous crashes. I quickly ran over to my neighbour's yard, attempting to clarify to the administrator what was going on, whereas looking over at my house in fear. From where I was, it looked noiseless and calm, but that as it were made it more frightening knowing that something horrendous was likely going on interior. After many minutes, in spite of the fact that nothing else was seen, and the cops at last made it. They looked the house to begin with at that point, brought me interior to conversation. They found different shoe prints within the storage room, and they suspected it was likely a group of youngsters messing around with me, and likely not attempting to cause any hurt. There were no signs of anybody living there or anything, which was alleviation. They found a few carvings within the wooden bars, in spite of the fact that, but they weren't anything particular, fair lines essentially. Once more, the cops assured me that the kids were likely fair messing with me and attempting to get a response out of me. As for how they got in, they think they may have some way or another gotten on the roof and climbed in through a window, whereas I was at work that day. In any case, they left through the storage room entryway on the ceiling and got out through my back entryway. I know they said certainly that it was fair a safe bunch of kids, but that doesn't make me feel any more secure. Knowing that a few arbitrary gather of people broke into my house and was camping out there all day and at night, whereas I was domestic, is truly terrifying. Cruel. Those cops didn't really know what the groups eagerly were either, so who knows what they really arranged on doing. As a kid, I developed up in an ordinary neighbourhood. We had a nice mid-sized domestic and a very ordinary family. When I turned 7, we received a little pooch named Max. He was my best companion for a long time, and as I grew up, I'd be domestic alone more regularly, but with Max there with me, I'd never truly feel like I was alone. I never felt the require to worry or be anxious of anything. Shockingly, this didn't final until the end of time, in spite of the fact that when I turned 15, my family sold our domestic and moved 20 minutes absent to a more disconnected, littler house in a forested zone. Tragically, that summer, Max passed away due to ancient age. I was appreciative that it was summer though, since I had time to lament at domestic without having to go to school or anything. After many days of the family lamenting together at the misfortune of our to begin with family pooch, things went back to normal. My guardians went back to work, and I remained domestic on summer break. Be that as it may, I quickly felt a contrast. This was the primary time I'd ever truly been totally domestic alone in my whole life. Without Max to continuously be by my side, I was continually neurotic and uneasy, almost each little sound coming from the house. Not to mention, we'd as it were lived within the put for some months, so I didn't indeed truly know the region or feel completely secure, however. Besides, fair a week after losing Max, it was another normal day. My guardians cleared out for work and I remained home. The house was only one story, so the format was fundamentally fair aligned. Once you walk within the front entryway, there's the kitchen and living room, which at that point leads to a long passage with 2 rooms on the side and my parents' room at the conclusion. For the past week of being alone, I'd always walked down the hallway and near all of the room entryways. For a few reasons, I didn't like seeing the entryways open within the corridor because it fair gave me an odd feeling. So this day was no distinctive. I went along the passage closing each entryway until I have to be my parents' room. I pulled the entryway through the doorway and started strolling back, but quickly realized that I didn't listen the press sound of the entryway being completely closed. So, I turned back around and pulled the entryway closed more solidly, this time hearing the press sound of the door locking in put. I went back to my room where I had my computer and closed the entryway. I put on my earphones and observed YouTube for nearly 2 hours straight since there wasn't much else to do. By this point, in spite of the fact that it was approximately 9 a.m. and I was prepared for a few breakfast, I laid my headphones on the work area and opened my room entryway, venturing into the passage. As I ventured out and turned towards the living room, I couldn't offer assistance, but take note something was off within the corner of my eye. I turned my head to see back down the corridor, and right away solidified. The entryway at the conclusion of the hallway was open. I mean, wide open. I must have stood there for an entire minute, just attempting not to form any noise and tune in for any development in my parents' room. At this point, in spite of the fact that I didn't know what to do, I knew that I had closed that entryway, and there was no way it seemed open on its claim, so I was lovely certain that some person may be within the house. I hadn't listened anything, in spite of the fact that, so I had no idea where they were. They may have been in any room within the house by presently. I'd chosen to exceptionally discreetly and gradually walk through the living room and into the kitchen, quickly swiveling my head all around, fearing that they were covering up some place. Upon coming to the kitchen, I snatched one of my parents' huge steak blades. Holding the cut firmly in my right hand, I felt somewhat way better but still terrified. I rapidly and carefully double-checked the living room and feasting room, making beyond any doubt that the interloper wasn't covering up any place. At that point stood at the conclusion of the corridor. I strolled down to the save room, attempting to open the entryway unobtrusively, but it was ancient and creaky. Everything appeared to be precisely how it was cleared out. Nothing moved at all. I sponsored out and closed the entryway. I spared my parents' bedroom for final because it was the room with the open entryway, and I was terrified. It didn't offer assistance that this house was within the centre of a timberland, knowing that no offer assistance was any place adjacent. I stood at the entryway for another diminutive, as it were able to see half of my parents' bed, whereas clutching the cut and tuning in, it was dead noiseless. Fear proceeded to rise interior me as I called out shakily, but there was no reaction. I attempted to sound certain, but I knew it was a lean act. I took a step interior, looking around the corner. It appeared purged, rather like the other rooms, with nothing moved at all. I indeed squatted and looked beneath the bed, but no one was there. I strolled to the other side of the bed, and fair as I taken note a little spot of earth on the floor, I listened a delicate crash from behind me. I hopped, heart hustling, and stared at the lavatory entryway that was closed. I made some wild-eyed development in there, whereas moreover seeing a slight shadow from beneath the entryway. A number of seconds passed as I stood in fear, some time recently heaving one final crash, taken after by strides blurring absent exterior of the house. Still in shock at what had fair happened, I carefully strolled over and opened the entryway, instantly taking note the open window. I rapidly closed and locked it. At that point ran to my room to seize my phone. I do not know why I never called the police. I figure I was fair youthful, and I didn't need them to come over on the off chance that no one was really there. But upon reflection, I know I should have fair cleared out the house and called the cops to start with. Besides, I called my guardians to begin with, who at that point called the police and came domestic before long after. During their examination, they found little patches of soil from someone's shoe beautiful much all through the total house but for my room. They were able to tell that it was as it were one individual. Be that as it may, unusually, they didn't take anything. Not a single thing was lost from our domestic. This was clearly truly frightening and abnormal, making the thought processes of the gatecrasher much more aggravating. We moved out of the house a few months afterward, in spite of the fact that mostly due to other issues with the house. Being in my 20s now, I still think approximately this experience each once in a whereas. I ponder what would have happened in case I wasn't wearing my earphones and listened the individual enter, since I likely would have looked and seen them. It's alarming to assume, but I'm grateful for how everything turned out aside from the gatecrasher never getting caught.